So in the late 1980s, when I was a much younger man, the time keeps going forward. It's like more than 30 years ago now. It's crazy. I was a student researcher aboard a sailing schooner, 125 feet long. It was a stay-sail schooner called the RV Westward. And I was studying, and this may not sound interesting, but it really was, Sargasso communities. So this was, these were impressive. They were oases in a desert ocean. These little biodiversity communities where these floating groups of seaweed would have in all kinds of life. And in addition to doing all the science on this boat, the students with me and a few crew were in charge of navigating the ship and setting the sails and doing all the things you do. And we were working in the Atlantic, outside the Antilles, and we've been out there for, I can't remember how long, weeks. We've been out there for weeks. And we came around into the Caribbean Sea, and what we found as we got into that part of things was that one of our water tanks had gotten fouled. We had a couple of them for drinking water, potable water that we could have, but it had gotten ruined by something that they couldn't have us drink out of that one. And we kept going, and so we were starting to think a little bit about water. I mean, it was one of those moments where you're looking all around at the water, but you can't drink it. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink, from that famous Rime of the Ancient Mariner poem. But the more days that began to pass with the water rationing, where we would get a little cup in the morning, a little cup in the afternoon, a little cup in the evening, the sun's beating down, this feeling started to come over us. It was in our bodies, but it was also a little bit in our minds. But we're like, well, we're going to get to the Dominican Republic. We're going to be able to get some water on board. But there was political unrest in the Dominican Republic, and we couldn't put in for water. So now we had to make it all the way back to the U.S. And as the days stretched on, you had that feeling get more and more a part of your everyday. You probably know the feeling. Maybe you've had it. After a long walk on a hot day, your mouth starts to feel dry. Your tongue feels thick and lethargic. Your lips start to feel cracked. You keep swallowing. There's not nearly enough in there. First, it can be a little mild. After a while, it begins to take over your awareness. You stop noticing the beauty of the world around you. You stop thinking about whatever you're thinking about. Your whole body starts to focus on just the one thing, how thirsty you are for just one big glass of water. You can imagine it, just that cold glass, ice cubes clinking against each other, the condensation running down the outside. You can almost feel the coolness of the glass in your hand, almost taste that clean freshness of the water. And when you finally actually get it, when that first swallow, it reaches the back of your throat, it's like your whole body sighs. And like your mind quiets and opens, and you feel like things are going to be okay. There's this feeling of relief and hope. Thirst is one of those most basic of human experiences. It's physical, it's immediate, it's undeniable. And if we're paying attention, thirst isn't only something that happens to our bodies. Sometimes it happens to our lives. Sometimes we thirst in ways that have little to do with water, but there's still thirst. Sometimes we thirst in ways that are mental or emotional or spiritual. Our first reading today from the book of Exodus takes us into one of those moments. The ancient Israelites, they're wandering in the wilderness. They've escaped slavery in Egypt. They've crossed the Red Sea. They're following Moses day by day. I imagine they're hoping for a better future, full and happy lives, but the journey's taking time, and things aren't easy, and the future may be feeling a little less certain. And now they've come to a place where there is no water. The text tells us the people are thirsty, and they begin to complain to Moses. They say, "Give us water to drink. Why did you bring us up out of Egypt? Just to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" You can hear the frustration in their voices. You can hear the fear and the anger. Fear so often leads to anger. And if you listen closely, you can hear something else too, that perhaps honestly and deeply, they're thirsty not only for water, although they are. They're thirsty for relief, for reassurance, for comfort, or for maybe even certainty that things are going to be all right, that things are going to be better. They're thirsty for hope, for progress, and for peace. Maybe what they want is assurances regarding their concerns or answers to their deeply felt questions, like whether or not they really should have ever left Egypt. Wasn't great, but we weren't going to die there this way. Maybe they're asking questions about if they're going to be okay or if the future really holds that much promise for them. Questions which seem to beg an even deeper question, whether or not they believe God is really with them. The people are thirsty, but it isn't only their bodies that are thirsty, their hearts. Their hearts are thirsty too. Which may be why this story feels somehow personal and relevant. We might not spend much of our lives wandering in the wilderness. We might not literally find ourselves in desert landscapes for day after day. But most of us know what it feels like to thirst. This thirst for water, we know that. And to thirst deeply for other things, we know that too. To be faced with our own uncertainties, our own adversities, to have hearts and minds that are seemingly consumed by questions and concerns, so much that if we wake up in the night, we can't get back to sleep. If we're awake during the day, we reach for some device to help distract us from all the feelings of longing. We have questions and concerns for all sorts of things, our lives, our loved ones, our communities, our world. We've had parts of our lives that feel dry, desiccated, brittle, or barren. Work or relationships or health, or we know what it is to thirst then for rest and relief. Life gets busy, demanding, full, and somewhere along the way we realize we're tired in a way that sleep alone can't fix. Sometimes we thirst for comfort and clarity. We're making decisions, we're carrying responsibilities, we're wondering what the future holds. Sometimes we thirst for meaning. We're going through all the motions in this life. We're working hard, we're doing our chores, we're keeping our commitments, but this quiet question starts forming underneath it all, kind of tugging at the corners of our minds, weighing heavy on our hearts. Is this really all there is? Is this the life that I'm going to have lived? Is this the life I want to be living? Sometimes we thirst for love or belonging or forgiveness. Sometimes we thirst simply for life to make sense again. And often, just like the Israelites, that thirst will show up in our life in subtle ways that we might not at first notice, in some kind of impatience or restlessness or irritability, in the feeling that something's not quite right, but we don't always know how to name it. But we can feel it like a thirst in our bodies or our minds or our spirit, this longing for something more, something to bring some peace or some wholeness, some fullness, and some life. Which brings us to the gospel reading for today, in which we find ourselves again with Jesus. He's been traveling through Samaria, and we're told that he's tired from his journey, and he sits down beside a well near the town of Sychar, and we're told rather precisely that it's noon. And a woman comes to the well to draw water, someone coming to do an everyday chore. It seems like a rather ordinary moment. And then Jesus speaks to her. And that alone would have been unexpected, actually, even surprising. To understand that a little more, it helps to see how unlikely it really was. Jews and Samaritans, they had lived for centuries with this ethnic and religious hostility and suspicion between them. It seems we humans, we can't seem to just get it together and get along and be kind. We find our differences and then we divvy up things and fight amongst ourselves. There was some of that. On top of that, in the culture of the time, it was unusual, even sometimes frowned upon, for an unrelated man and woman to strike up a conversation in public. And then there's this quiet detail about the woman herself. She comes to the well at noon, in the heat of the day, rather than in the cool of the morning, when the other folks would normally and naturally have come to get the water they would need for breakfast and for washing and for everything for the day. And it hints that she may have been trying to avoid people, perhaps carrying some loneliness or some shame or some sense of being on the outside of things. And in fact, in another part of the conversation Jesus has with her that we didn't hear in our reading this morning, we do learn that she was on the outs with so much in her community because of some of the choices and circumstances in her life. But in all of this encounter, this conversation really shouldn't be happening. And yet Jesus sees her, and he speaks with her, and he asks her simply and gently for a drink of water. He doesn't shame her. He doesn't lecture her. He speaks to her with openness and with honesty and respect and kindness. And as the conversation unfolds, it becomes clear that this woman's thirst goes far deeper than the water she came to collect. And it seems that Jesus sees her brokenness and her longing, sees the deeper thirst for acceptance, for understanding, forgiveness, friendship, healing, wholeness. And so Jesus begins to speak to her about living water. Water that becomes a spring within a person, he says. Water that wells up to abundant life, overflowing kind of life. A life nourished by the presence of God's Spirit, a life in which the deep thirsts of the heart begin to be met. One of the most beautiful things about this story for me is how it happens. The woman simply comes to draw water at this public well. Ordinary task, ordinary place, middle of an ordinary day. And yet, in that very ordinary moment, she encounters the living presence of God. And that is part of the good news of our good God. God meets us right in the middle of our everyday lives. Not only when we're feeling spiritually strong, not only when we've got things figured out, but when we're simply going about our day, doing the things we do. Even if we're distracted or doubtful, searching or tired, when we're thirsty, sometimes God shows up in familiar places. Sometimes God shows up in surprising ones. Sometimes in the most difficult ones. Think again about the Israelites. They're standing in a barren place where there's no water. It looks like the sort of place from which no life could really emerge. Yet somehow, mysteriously, God brings water from the rock, from the very place that seemed most unlikely. That's a pattern that you can see again and again and again in the scriptures. God bringing life from unexpected places, hope from barren ground, grace in the midst of a struggle, living water in moments when everything everywhere is desiccated and dry. And that's good news. Because it means for us that even in our thirst, with our questions and our longings and our uncertainties in our lives, they all can become places where God meets us. So what can that mean for us in this season of Lent? Maybe one place to begin is simply this. A good spiritual practice for the days ahead could be simply to pay attention to your thirst. Plainly and physically. Stay hydrated. Carry your water bottles. Keep track of that. It's important. 80 ounces is good. 100 is better. Pretty soon you're floating through the world. But they keep saying more water is better. And if you drink a bunch, you do feel better. So be healthy. But beyond that, notice your thirst more deeply. Notice the places in your life where something feels dry or unsettled or you feel rough or brittle. Notice the impatience or the irritability that sometimes creeps in, or the edginess or the anxiety. The restlessness, that quiet sense that something's missing and something's needed. And instead of pushing that stuff away or trying to run away from it, Lent invites us to lean in and listen. These may be signs pointing toward the deeper longings of our hearts. And then maybe the spiritual practice is to begin watching for the ways God can meet us in any moment. Not always in dramatic ways, often in ordinary ones, maybe in small pauses during the day. Moments when we can breathe deeply and become aware of God's presence. Maybe the great reminder for us this week would be simple encounters with water. When you're brushing your teeth or you're washing your hands. Lots of health advice today, don't you think? Or when the rain falls from the sky, or heaven help us when the snow comes back. Or when you're pouring a glass of water in the kitchen. Let the water be reminders, little reminders that it'd be good to take a moment to pause and pray before you proceed. Moments to remember that beneath all the surface concerns of life, something deeper is happening. We're thirsty people, and yet the promise of the gospel is that God knows this. God sees the deeper thirst in our lives and offers us living water, water that renews, water that restores, water that becomes somehow a quiet spring within us. And what we're talking about is a life nourished by the Spirit of God. So this week, maybe the invitation's simple. Notice our thirst. And in the moments when we reach for water, we pause for just a second, we take a breath, and we remember the God who brought water from the rock, the Christ who spoke beside the well, is still with us, still meeting us in ordinary places, still offering us living water for thirsty hearts. Please pray with me. Holy One, thank you that again and again, when you are most needed, when we are least ready, you show up for us, perhaps in unlikely or unexpected places, in the most ordinary moments. And you come with your Spirit to offer us what is needed, that our deepest thirsts of heart can be quenched. that we can be made full to overflowing with your life and your love and your peace for ourselves and for the world around us. In your name we pray. Amen. Please stand for the hymn of the day.